Hello. Well, today I'm going to be talking to you about variations in sexual behavior, chapter 14. So, we're going to start with a discussion. When is sexual behavior abnormal? Well, we can look at a lot of difference of normality and abnormality to try to answer this question. When is sexual behavior abnormal? Well, we can look at a statistical definition. We can say, well, according to statistics, a sexual behavior that's rare or not practiced by many people would be considered abnormal. From a sociological approach, a sexual behavior that violates the norms of a society would be considered abnormal. From a psychological approach, a sexual behavior that included discomfort or inefficiency or bizarreness could be described as being abnormal. And according to the medical approach, they have recognized in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the 5th edition, 8 paraphilias. So according to the DSM-5, there are 8 paraphilias. And so psychological disorders based on abnormal sexual behavior. Well, what's a paraphilia? Well, a paraphilia is any intense and persistent sexual interest other than sexual interest in genital stimulation or preparatory fondling with phenotypically normal, physically mature, consenting human partners. So let's redo that. I like to break this down in class. So paraphilia is any intense and persistent sexual interest other than a sexual interest in genital stimulation or preparatory fondling with phenotypically normal, physically mature, consenting human partners. Another way to describe a paraphilia is it's a recurring, unconventional sexual behavior that's obsessive and compulsive. So in trying to decide what's abnormal in sexual behavior, instead of it being a dichotomous question, I like to think of sexual behavior as being on a continuum, the normal-abnormal continuum. So normal and abnormal sexual behavior are not two different separate categories, but rather they're gradations on a continuum. A mild or even a strong preference for an object is within the normal range of sexual behavior, but it's abnormal if it becomes an extreme necessity. So I love this image. I think this helps to describe this really well. So this is an image of the continuum for normal to abnormal behavior, and it's showing the strength of preference for a fetish object. Say that I had a proclivity to be sexually aroused by high-heeled shoes. High-heeled shoes. And a mild preference for high-heeled shoes may be me feeling sexually aroused when I would see people wearing high-heeled shoes and think, wow, that person looks really sexy. Really love those shoes. That person's looking really good in those shoes. A strong preference would be, wow, I have a partner and I'm like, honey, I wear those high-heeled shoes. And I tend to buy high-heeled shoes because I really have a strong preference for high-heeled shoes. They really make me think that is uber sexy. Now, normal begins when the high-heeled shoes become a necessity for sexual arousal. So in order to become sexually aroused, you better be wearing your high-heeled shoes, or else I cannot get sexually aroused, right? So it becomes a necessity for sexual arousal. And that's really where we can think of on the continuum for normal, abnormal behavior that I like to consider abnormality kind of beginning, and that is when it becomes necessary for the person to become sexually aroused. And then even further along the continuum of abnormality is if that inanimate object, the high-heeled shoes, starts to become a substitute for human partner, so that it's no longer I really even need my partner to be wearing the high-heeled shoes. Like, really, I'm happier with just my high-heeled shoes and myself. That's how I really prefer it to be, is just me and my high-heeled shoes. Or my partner's high-heeled shoes. All right, so let's talk about fetishes. Fetishes are sexual fantasies, urges, or behaviors involving the use of non-living objects. The sexual fantasies, urges, or sexual behaviors involving the use of non-living objects to produce or to enhance sexual arousal with or in the absence of a partner over a period of at least 6 months if it becomes a disorder, and that's causing significant distress if it is a fetish disorder, right? So people can have fetishes that aren't at the level of having a disorder, right? They may just be sexually aroused by somebody wearing high-heeled shoes or wearing latex boots or wearing, some sort of fabulous fur or something, right? And they just become sexually aroused when someone wears those pieces of clothing. And maybe they become sexually aroused even just looking at that clothing. But if it becomes a disorder, then it has to have been there for at least 6 months, and it must be causing significant distress in the person's life or in their work, relationships, or education. Right? So just like other psychological disorders, there must be a impact on and work, school, relationships. And in this case, there is a length requirement that the person had to have had this fetish for at least 6 months. So there's 2 different types of fetishes. There's media fetish and form fetish. So a media fetish is one that depends on the material out of which the object is made. And so for a media fetishist, it's the material that's important, that's the source of arousal for that person. And there's hard media fetishists and soft media fetishists. So in a hard media fetish, a hard substance like leather or rubber, it's what's causing the sexual arousal. And so you've heard of leather clubs, right? Or latex clubs, where people meet other people that share their fetish for a particular hard media. And in this case, that would be leather, rubber, or other hard materials. In a soft media fetish, the person has a fetish for a soft substance like silk or like fur. And so those are 2 different types of media fetishes. Hard media fetish, the substance is hard that causes them to become sexually aroused. And a soft media fetish, the substance is soft that causes the sexual arousal. So for instance, some people only wear silk nightgowns, and they have silk sheets, and silk is a very important part of their sexual arousal, and they aren't able to get sexually aroused without the silk if it's a disorder. If it's not a disorder, have a proclivity to enjoying silk in their sexual behaviors. And so a form fetish is when the object and its shape are what is important for an arousal. So like, for instance, shoes, right? Or it could be something that's shaped like a penis, right? And the material doesn't matter. It is the form of the item, the object and its shape. So here's an iClicker question. Which of the following people would be described as having a hard media fetish? George, who can never have sex with his wife unless the TV is on in the background. Jason, who experiences intense sexual arousal when he's Jacob, who is sexually aroused by the smell and feel of leather, or Saul, who refuses to engage in any sexual activity unless his partner. Which one is the hard media fetish? Yeah, it's C. It's Jacob, right? Because leather is a hard material. Jason, who prefers and becomes sexually aroused with fur coats, what is that? A soft media fetish. That's right. So you may be curious, well, how do people develop these fetishes, right? And you may remember me telling you a story about learning theory when we were talking about the theory behind many different sexual behaviors. And I told you the story of a high school student who had a science teacher who wore these amazing black patent leather boots, right? And so this kid was just really becoming of age sexually, and like this teacher was so attracted to him. He was very attracted to this teacher, really was into this teacher, and she always wore these patent leather boots, right? And so the teacher was so beautiful that naturally she caused people to feel attracted to her, right? But over time, what was a neutral stimulus, these patent leather boots, compared with the unconditioned stimulus, and they become associated with each other, so that eventually when the high schooler is just walking at the mall looking for Christmas presents with his mom and he sees a pair of black leather boots, what happens? He gets an erection. He becomes sexually aroused because he's developed an association between those boots and that teacher, so that just the conditioned stimulus alone is causing the conditioned response, right? So that's an example of learning theory as a way to explain the development of fetishes. Cognitive theory would explain fetishes differently. According to cognitive theorists, fetishes have a serious cognitive distortion in that they are perceiving a non-conventional stimulus as being erotic, right? And so they would work to change those cognitive distortions and replace them with more adaptive ways of thinking. Addiction theorists would explain fetishes by saying that there's a pathological relationship with the fetish object, with a sexual event or a process that begins to substitute for a healthy relationship with other people. And so that a person starts to be so obsessed with the fetish object, the high-heeled shoes, that they start to spend all of their time around the high-heeled shoes, and they no longer spend time with their relationship partner. They no longer desire to have sex with their relationship partner, and it begins to substitute with having healthy relationships with other people. And so addiction theorists would explain the development of fetishes in that way. So let's talk about compulsive sexual behavior. Well, compulsive sexual behavior consists of intense sexually arousing fantasies, urges, and their associated sexual behaviors. They're intrusive, it's driven, and it's repetitive. So compulsive sexual behavior, for the person who engages in compulsive sexual behavior, these fantasies and these urges and their associated sexual behaviors are very intrusive. Like they can just be sitting down doing something and all of a sudden these thoughts intrude into what they were doing. The person feels driven, like they must get their next sexual interaction. And it's something that happens repetitively, right? It's not just today. It's not just, summer. It happens repetitively in the person's life. People who engage in compulsive sexual behavior tend to have a lack of impulse control. So when they feel sexual arousal, they want to have a sexual encounter. And so it's very difficult for them to kind of recognize that with sexual arousal, it doesn't have to be followed by sexual behavior. They lack this kind of impulse control. For people who engage in compulsive sexual behavior, many times they incur social as well as legal sanctions. People who are in relationships with people who engage in compulsive sexual behavior oftentimes don't like the competition with other individuals or with other types of porn or media, and so they can end up with a relationship problem. Sometimes they spend a lot of money having sex with prostitutes or sex workers. They may they may get in trouble because of legal sanctions, because who they choose to have sex with, and it's illegal for them to have sex with those people, or that maybe they're engaging in sex in front of other people, or things like that. So people engaged in compulsive sexual behavior oftentimes incur social and legal sanctions. It tends to interfere with their personal as well as occupational functioning. And so the intrusiveness, kind of that drive to get the next fix, and the repetitiveness of it means that oftentimes people get caught engaging in sexual behaviors at their workplace. So when I was in medical school, there was a student there who was a really fabulous medical school student and really, really smart. And I remember one day he was no longer there, and then over time I learned that he had been kicked out of medical school because he was looking at porn when he was at the hospital. And I was like, what? He was doing what? Like, how that? Like, I didn't understand. And that was kind of the first time that I started to be curious about compulsive sexual behavior, because this person had risked their whole career. They had loans from college and loans from medical school. And I was like, I don't understand why he couldn't just wait till he went home, right? And so I was like, there's got to be something going on neurologically, psychologically, right, socioculturally, that this happened for him. And so it really can interfere with a person's personal life as well as their occupational functioning. And it can create health risks. And so when you're engaging in behaviors at a very high frequency, right, you can harm yourself physically by getting a sexually transmitted infection. If it's not treated, right, you can end up harming your health for the long term. Also, you can also get infections and other things. All right, so let's switch gears a little bit and talk about cross-dressing. Well, what's cross-dressing? Well, cross-dressing is dressing as a member of another gender. The cross-dressing that we oftentimes think about are drag queens, right? Gay men who dress up as women. And if you've never seen a drag show, you should definitely go at some point in your life and see a drag show. Just the absolute beauty of the people there, and their amazing entertainment and amazing talent. So if you've never seen a drag show, I would suggest you check one out at some time. Then there's also female impersonators, men who dress as women, oftentimes as part of an entertainment job. And so you can think of like impersonators that you have seen perhaps at different amusement parks, right, where people are dressing up as where males are dressing up as a female as part of their way to entertain. Then there's transvestism. Transvestite fetishism is a heterosexual man who dresses in female clothing in order to produce or enhance their very own sexual arousal. And so in the fetishist form of transvestite fetishism, really the goal is that it causes that person to be sexually aroused. And so I have known some people in the past who would wear like a woman's garter belt, men who would wear women's garter belt that would hold up stockings, or women's underwear to become sexually aroused. And so they wear them under their clothes, but knowing that they were wearing that female undergarments was sexually arousing to them. And so that's an example of transvestite fetishism, where a heterosexual man in order to produce or enhance their own sexual arousal. Transvestism is almost exclusively a male sexual variation, and it's essentially pretty unknown among women. It tends to be really much more common in men than in women. So transvestic disorder is when transvestic fetishism persists for at least 6 months, and it has to cause clinically significant distress in that person's life and impacting their social, occupational, or educational life. All right, so let's switch gears and talk about sadism and masochism, right? So, what's a sexual sadist? Well, a sexual sadist is a person who derives sexual satisfaction from inflicting pain on another person. More broadly, it could be inflicting suffering or humiliation on another person. So a sadist is someone who derives sexual pleasure from inflicting pain or suffering or humiliation on another human being. And a sexual masochist is a person who derives sexual satisfaction from pain. More broadly, a sexual masochist is someone who is sexually aroused by fantasies, urges, or behaviors that involve being beaten, humiliated, bound, or tortured in order to enhance or to achieve their sexual excitement. So it doesn't actually have to be from actually experiencing pain. In the more broad definition, it can be from having fantasies or urges that involve their wishes to be beaten, humiliated, bound, or tortured, and that will increase their sexual excitement. So what was really one of the first mainstream things in our mainstream media culture that really started an interest in sadism and masochism? Did you say 50 Shades? Yeah, so 50 Shades is really the thing that brought sadism and masochism into kind of an everyday household word for adults, right? And so there's a lot more interest and I think curiosity around sadism and masochism than ever before because of those books and movies. And I think one of the things that's really important to understand about S&M lifestyles is that for some people it is a lifestyle, and there are clubs, right? There's 2 different places in Memphis that people go and meet other people who are also into S&M. And I think one of the important things to know is that for many people who engage in the S&M lifestyle, there's a really huge emphasis on consent and really amazing amount of about the sexual behaviors that the person wants to engage in, doesn't want to engage in, is willing to try. There's safe words. There are sometimes oral or written contracts about what the partners do or don't want to do. And so I think that the thing that is really important to know is that you've got to be willing to have really detailed discussions before you engage in S&M sex play. And I think that's one of the things that concerns me, is that people aren't having these detailed discussions, and they're engaging in these role-playing behaviors where they're engaging and trying new types of sexual behaviors that may be painful to a sexual partner, and they haven't talked about safe words, they haven't talked about hard limits, they haven't talked about these things, and that's very, very dangerous. And so if this is some sexual behavior you want to kind of try on, some sadism and masochism, then you've got to do some research, some preparation, have some important conversations to make sure that you and your sex partner are safe. In S&M, there's 2 styles of interaction: bondage and discipline, where there's a use of physical or psychological restraints to enforce servitude, and then dominance and submission, where there's a use of power consensually given to control the sexual stimulation and the behavior of the other person. So sadomasochistic behavior, sadomasochism is a rare form of sexual behavior. The actual fantasizing about it is much less rare. In its milder forms, though, it's probably much more common than you think, right? Kinsey found that about 26% of females and males had experienced an erotic response as a result of being bitten during sexual activity, right? So it depends on what we think of as being sadomasochistic behavior. Scratching your partner's back, having your back scratched, right? Biting a partner, right? Spanking a partner, um, or whether you're talking about a more detailed sadomasochistic behavior. Kind of what causes the sexual arousal during administering or receiving pain, kind of the causes are not precisely known. Um, the sadistic and masochistic fantasies appear to be much more common than real life sadomasochistic behavior. Although, like I said, since 50 Shades of Grey, lots of people are kind of trying this on and seeing if they like this behavior. And so I just want to encourage y'all to practice if you decide to do this type of behavior. Make sure that you're being safe and have these really important conversations, and do your research. So in bondage and discipline, sexual bondage is the use in sexual behavior of restraining devices that usually have a sexual significance. It's a staple of erotic fiction and art for centuries, right? So you can go back and look at bondage art for centuries. Very interesting. Most men and women in bondage and discipline prefer the passive role, which I think is very interesting, right? So they prefer to be more passive than to be more active. And in dominance and submission, the key is really about this being able to dominate someone else. It's really an illusion of control, not actual control, that's central to dominance and submission activity or play. And it's really not like a wild outbreak of violence, but it's about role playing, where one person may be serving as the master, the other person the slave, or a naughty child that needs to be punished. And so although people may think that it looks like it's not scripted, it is very carefully controlled performance that has a script, with things that people have agreed upon before the sexual activity began, where there is a safe word, and really where there's a lot of mutual respect. All right, so let's now switch gears and talk a little bit about voyeurism and exhibitionism. Well, there's two different types of voyeurs. There's scoptophilia, where the person derives sexual pleasure from observing sexual acts in the genitals. And so really it's about observing the act of sex and people's genitals. That's scoptophilia. For a voyeur, the person becomes sexually aroused from secretly viewing nudes, often while masturbating. So there doesn't have to be any sex act involved. You don't have to see the genitals. It's really about the nude body. And for voyeurs, they're oftentimes viewing these nudes while they're masturbating. Voyeurism becomes paraphilic when the fantasies, urges, or behaviors continue for at least 6 months, clinically significant distress, or interpersonal dysfunction. So let me tell you a story of mine about when I was in college. I was an au pair back then, a fancy word for a live-in babysitter for a couple who were divorced, and the kids lived in the house, and the parents came and went. I was an au pair in Southern California, and this couple had it worked out. They realized they had divorced it, but the children should be allowed to stay in their home, and that the children should be kind of at the center, and they would just come and go to the main house. And so I was living in kind of this outside the home space, kind of an offshoot of a garage that had been closed in. And I just gotten out of the shower, and I was walking into the closet of this area, and it was kind of a extension of the garage, and there was a window there, but outside that window there was only about 4 feet to a big hedge on the property line. And so there wasn't anybody that could see me, so I'd oftentimes just walk from the shower directly to my clothes racks to look at my clothes to decide what I was going to wear. And as I was walking in there, I thought I kind of saw something out of the corner of my eye, but I wasn't sure, but I thought that was kind of strange. And I went back to the bathroom to get something a robe to put on, and I walked back into the kind of walk-in and closet area, and I kind of was like, I really do think I saw something. So I kind of peered my face to the window and in between the clothes, and I looked either way, and there was a person standing there, a person with a penis who had their pants down around their ankles and was masturbating. And of course, I screamed really loud. And the person gathered up their pants, I guess, and ran off because by the time people came from the house, the person was gone. And it turns out that this person had been working at a construction near the house, and they had been there for about 6 months. And so who knows how long this had been going on. But that was kind of my first experience of understanding what voyeurism was, right? And so that was my experience of a voyeurist when I was in college. So voyeurism is kind of the opposite of exhibitionism, right? Voyeurism is watching other people, and exhibitionism is sharing yourself. So exhibitionism, also called flashing, the person derives sexual pleasure from exposing their genitals to others in situations where this is clearly inappropriate. And you'll notice the pronoun is his genitals because it's extremely much more common in males than it is in females. But I do think it's interesting because we think about flashers like maybe someone who wears a long trench coat or raincoat and flashes themselves to people. That does happen. And in fact, at the University of Memphis in the library, we used to have a flasher for many years that would be in the journal book, the book area, those stacks, I guess you call it. And he would flash himself. And he eventually stopped coming. So I haven't heard a story about him in a long time. But for a while, there was a flasher at our own U of M library. But I think that this next point is really interesting because I think a man who exposes himself is considered very offensive, right? And can be arrested. But a woman who reveals most of her breast is really likely to be thought of as attractive. And so there's kind of a double standard here, right? Where kind of one of the main things of sexuality and for people who have vaginas is breasts. And so our culture really accepts a lot of breast showing. In fact, right, Mardi Gras is all about showing your breasts, right? And women showing their breast, whereas a man who exposes himself or a person who has a penis who exposes himself or their self is considered to be offensive. And so it's interesting, thought-provoking, I think. The causes of exhibitionism are also not known. What makes people want to show their private genitals to other people or their breasts to other people is unknown. So what would probably be the best strategy for a woman at the receiving end of an exhibitionist behavior to prevent that individual from getting the sexual gratification that he is seeking from the act? Is it A, scream rape at the top of one's voice and run? Is it B, use pepper spray or some other self-defense technique? Is it C, remain calm and maybe suggest that the exhibitionist seek professional help? Or D, clearly express shock and disgust and walk off? So what do you think is the best strategy? Here's a number of different strategies, right? But what do you think would be the best strategy, particularly for the exhibitionist, right? So we think about who are we talking about the best strategy for? So the best strategy for the woman who's at the receiving end of the exhibitionist behavior. If we're trying to change the exhibitionist behavior, we can do that in a lot of different ways, right? But according to the authors of this text, really it's C, remain calm and maybe suggest that the exhibitionist seek professional help. And that's if you feel like you're in a safe space, right? And you feel like you don't need to call for help, right? that's one thing you could do. So if you're at the library and there's, hundreds of other people there, and you could just look at that person and say, I think that it's going to be dangerous for you, right? And that maybe you should seek help for this. Now, if you do not feel safe, then I would suggest you leave the area as soon as possible, right? And defend yourself. But most people who are exhibitionists are not trying to harm anyone else ever. And most people who engage in exhibitionist behaviors are never trying to harm other people. They're trying to gain sexual gratification from showing themselves to other people. So now let's talk about hypersexuality and asexuality. So hypersexuality is an excessive, insatiable sex drive in either men or women, right? So people of any sex, it leads to compulsive behavior. And sexuality tends to overshadow all other concerns and interests. So when we think about compulsive sexual behavior, people who engage in compulsive sexual behavior, oftentimes we'll describe them as being hypersexual. For women who are hypersexual, we generally give them a label of being nymphomaniacs or engaging in nymphomania. For hypersexuality in men, we call that satyriasis. So hypersexuality is this excessive, insatiable sex drive. Paul is becoming frustrated with his partner, Amanda. Every time they try to go see a movie or to have dinner, Amanda comes on to him sexually. Paul enjoys this sex, but he's frustrated because he never gets to eat dinner out or to see the movies anymore. Amanda never seems satisfied when they do engage in intercourse, even if it's 3 times in one evening. Which of the following sexual variations best accounts for Amanda's behavior? A, hypersexuality, B, trollism, C, fetishism, or D, frauderism? It's hypersexuality. All right, so now let's talk about asexuality. Well, asexuality is defined as a lack of sexual attraction to a person of... And asexuality is different from not engaging in sexual behavior. It's really about not feeling sexually attracted, right? So whether or not the person is engaging in sex is a different question. Asexuality is really about a lack of sexual attraction to a person of any sex. People who are asexual are also different from celibates, right? People who are celibate may have sexual attraction. They just have made a cognitive decision to not engage in sexual behavior. So being asexual and being celibate are two different things as well. And just because you're asexual and lack a sexual attraction to people of any sex doesn't mean that you don't sometimes engage in sexual behavior for other reasons. Asexuality, according to some, may be a disorder rather than a paraphilia. Some people like to use asexuality as a type of sexual orientation, and some people feel like it is not a type of sexual orientation. And so we still have a lot as a discipline to do to understand asexuality, the causes, and I have many friends who would describe themselves as being asexual and are really happy living a life without engaging in sex, have no desire to have sex with anyone, and live a really happy and full life. Now let's talk about cybersex use and abuse. Cybersex is characterized by anonymity, accessibility, and affordability, right? So it's free, it's accessible all the time, 24/7, and it provides anonymity. Online sexual activity, particularly cybersex, is when two engage in sexual talk for the purposes of sexual pleasure, right? And so for engaging in sexually erotic behaviors. Then there's also cybersex compulsives. So cybersex compulsives are about 1% of cybersex users. They attain the highest scores on compulsivity. They're much more likely to be male and more likely to be single and dating. They more likely to report being bisexual, and they report spending about 15 to 25 hours per week in online sexual pursuits. Let's do the math. That's about 2 to 3.5 hours a day, right? In online sexual pursuits. That's a lot, right? 21% reported online activities jeopardized at least one area of their life. The most common area of their life being jeopardized are their personal relationships with other people. Now let's talk about some other sexual variations. Another sexual variation that some people often are curious about is asphyxophilia, also known as hypoxophilia, which is the desire to induce in oneself a state of oxygen deficiency in order to create sexual arousal or to enhance excitement, orgasm. People engage in asphyxophilia in a belief that arousal and orgasm are intensified by reduced oxygen levels. Asphyxophilia is an extremely dangerous behavior. It can lead to death because oftentimes what happens is when the person chokes themselves enough or chokes their partner enough for the person's oxygen level to drop enough, the person may pass out. And particularly if the person is engaging in asphyxophilia by themselves, like using a belt or something, then the person passes out and they do not remove the belt and they can die. And it's really tragic because what happens oftentimes is friends or family find their loved one and the person has been basically strangled to death, either from a rope or a belt or some other device. And sometimes people don't understand why the person's naked, and it can be really difficult. There's a lot of, I think, social judgment around asphyxophilia and around suicide. And so sometimes people will just tell friends and family that they're to die by suicide rather than telling them that they were engaging in asphyxophilia. But please, it's a very, very dangerous behavior. It basically kills your brain cells, right? And if the strangulation is not loosened, right, it can lead to death. So it's really, really dangerous. Some other sections are zoophilia or bestiality, which is sexual contact with an animal. It's illegal in the United States of America. It is not illegal in all countries. And so, people joke about people having sexual behavior with animals. Here in the United States, it is illegal. Frauderism is another type of sexual variation. It's when people's sexual fantasies or their urges or their sexual behaviors involve touching or rubbing their genitals against the body of a non-consenting person. So let me tell you another story about my college days. When I was in college, I went to school at Pepperdine University in Malibu, California. And on the weekends, sometimes we would go down to Santa Monica, California, where there was an outdoor kind of plaza, a mall that had two kind of rows of stores, and you could walk and kind of window shop, and there were kind of street shows, performers that would come and earn tips for their amazing talents. And you can imagine being so close to Hollywood and Southern California, these street performers were absolutely top-notch amazing. And so one day I was there with some friends and we were walking down the promenade, and there was a street show that had just started, but we saw it like forming as we were walking up, and all of a sudden it was filling up because these guys were absolutely amazing performers, and the kind of the area around the performance had already filled up. There was a big planter that was there, and so it was kind of an architectural thing that was about 3 feet wide that surrounded this really beautiful thing of flowers and a tree. And so me and my friends, we just jumped on that, and we were kind of the first row of people that that were on the planter. And all of a sudden, as there was more and more excitement, people started getting behind us on this kind of 3 feet ledge of this standing planter. So I'm watching this amazing set of performers, and all of a sudden I'm like, what is that? Like on my back of my leg, on my thigh, at the top, like on the back, and I was like, what is that feeling, right? And of course, like people are watching the performers, and everybody's like laughing and clapping, and like I'm thinking to myself, what is that, right? And all of a sudden, I was like, I could no longer act like I do not know, and I was like, oh my gosh! And so I jumped off this big into the audience, and I turned around because my friends were like, what? And of course, this person had been rubbing themselves on me. So that was my first experience of frauderism in my college years. So the next sexual variation I'm going to talk about is trialism or triolism. And that refers to a sexual encounter in which one partner watches the other partner engage in sex with a third party. This is also a really dangerous sexual behavior. And let me tell you why. Is two of the people, the partners, may have agreed that they both really enjoy this sexual behavior, right? And so they may invite an unknowing person for one of the partners to have sex with them. And one of the partners is watching their partner have sex with this other stranger, may hide, like in a closet or through a mirror in the bathroom. And that can be all well and good unless the stranger something, right? And thinks somebody is coming in on them. And then they may attack the other partner. They may shoot them, beat them up, right? And so things can get very dangerous very, very quickly. And so I just want to tell you that trialism is something that can be extremely dangerous when you are engaging in sex with someone and they don't know that someone else is watching. Another sexual variation is called soleromania. It's found mainly in men. It's a desire to damage or to soil a woman or her clothing. And coprophilia is when feces are an important part to sexual satisfaction. And urophilia is when urine is an important part of sexual satisfaction. And so you may have heard of stories where people offer money to people for using them as sex objects to urinate on them, right? And people sometimes offer a lot of money to have someone allow them to do what they call a golden shower, where they urinate on the other person. And so urophilia is a descriptive label describing that sexual behavior. Another sexual variation is necrophilia, where people prefer to have sexual contact with a dead person. You can imagine that people don't take kindly to finding out that their dead relative has somebody has had sex with their dead relative. So necrophilia is also illegal. Sexsomnia, sleep sex, literally, is a sleep disorder. It's not a paraphilia. It happens when people have these automatic, unintentional sexual behaviors that happen during sleep. This is also something that if you're a sexsomniac, you need to know, because you can do sexual behaviors towards other people without getting their consent. And so you will definitely need to let people in your life know, and you'll definitely want to get a single dorm room, right? Never have roommates that do not know that this is a problem for you, because you can obviously be charged with sexual assault. But this does happen for some people where they experience sleep sex or sexsomnia. Jeffrey Dahmer, a serial killer in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, who had sex with corpses can be called A, zoophiliac, B, necrophiliac, C, urophiliac, or D, scoptophiliac? Which one would Jeffrey Dahmer be described as? B, a necrophiliac, right? Okay, good. Okay, so what do we know about preventing sexual variations? Well, you can imagine it's kind of primary prevention. Most people don't like you to talk about sex education at all, much less educate people on these different sexual variations, right? And so, how do you do primary prevention? The categories for diagnosis are not nearly as clear cut as they may seem, like what differentiates one sexual variation from another sexual variation. We know that people oftentimes have multiple diagnoses, so they are likely to have more than one sexual variation. One of the things that we do when we're studying sexual variation and understanding someone's variations is analyze the components of their sexual development, talk to them about kind of their gender development, their sexual development, ask about questions about their gender identity and their sexual responsiveness, how they are able to form relationships with other people. And what we found through research is that people who have multiple types of these sexual variations tend to have a disturbance in one or more of these components. And there is an interest in developing preventive programs targeting kids, particularly in those sexual variations that harm other people, right? And so that we'd like from ever being developed because we don't want them to harm other people. So when we think about the treatment of sexual variations, one of the things that we know and that we talked about, y'all, was surgical and hormonal castration. Y'all may remember that from our amazing debate team. Surgical castration is used fairly commonly in the U.S. in the 1800s as a treatment for various uncontrollable sexual urges. Surgical castration, as we know, has become less frequent than hormonal treatment, where they use drugs to reduce the androgen production or block the effects of androgens or testosterone. And so hormonal treatments are more common now. The only problem is that people can just stop taking them, and those sorts of tendencies may come back for them. Psychopharmacological treatment has also been used. So they use psychotropic medications with psychological functioning and their behavior. And some of the SSRIs we know have sexual side effects. And so sometimes people will be put on those SSRIs to decrease their amount of sexual behaviors because we know that it does that for some individuals. What else has been used to treat sexual variations? Well, cognitive behavioral therapies have been used. Behavior therapy has been used to reduce inarousal and to enhance appropriate arousal. And so rewarding people for appropriate arousal, punishing them for inappropriate sexual arousal. Social skills training has also been used to help people learn to develop relationships with other individuals rather than counting on objects. Modifications have also been made to people's thinking processes if they have distorted thinking by challenging the rationalizations that that person uses to justify their undesirable behavior. And so, for instance, if somebody's a necrophiliac, trying to convince them that that body that's there does not want to be sexually adorned, sexually assaulted, that even though that person's not living, that body doesn't want that, and that family does not want that for their loved one's body. And so modifying distorted thinking, you've heard those comments about, that you'll hear people talk about people who engage in pedophilia, right? That sometimes they'll give as a defense that the little girl was dressed so provocatively that she obviously wanted this attention, and trying to help the people who engage in pedophilia to understand that no, in fact, that 5-year-old, 7-year-old young girl did not want that type of attention. They may wanted another type of attention, but they did not want sexual attention. They did not want to be assaulted. They did not want to be harassed. And so helping them modify their distorted thinking is one way that we can really help people decrease their sexual behaviors that are harmful. Another thing that's really important when we think about treating sexual variations is relapse prevention. So when people get treatment for sexual variations, they're going to end up leaving the treatment setting and going back to their home, to their community. And you're going to want to help that person identify and control or avoid whatever is triggering their behavior. And so perhaps they live in a school area where there's, young, playground. And so it might be a good idea. And in fact, legally, we know that people who have been arrested for pedophilia are not allowed to live within a certain distance from schools because it's triggering, right, for them. And so in order to keep the school children safe, there's legal laws about sex offenders living within a certain distance from schools. And so being able to help the person who's engaging in these sexual variations that are harming other people identify what triggers their behavior can be helpful, because then you can try to teach them how to avoid those triggers, right? Or think of alternative behaviors that don't harm other people. Multi-systemic therapy has been really well studied in targeting young sex offenders. They use a combination of family therapy, skills training, as well as cognitive behavioral therapy. And they work to address the youth's denial of their sexual offense, as well as their caregiver's denial of the youth having engaged in this sexually offensive behavior. It also addresses minimizing access to potential victims. And so if there's a child who's engaging in this inappropriate sexual contact with other children, then making sure that their time with other kids is supervised, right? That they're not left alone with other children. Also making sure that they get appropriate and normative social experience with peers. And so you don't want to totally take these children who are engaging in inappropriate sexual behaviors totally away from peers. You want to supervise them so that they can have appropriate and normative social experience with peers, so they can develop these social skills that help them be engaged with society rather than isolating and self-soothing themselves through inappropriate sexual behaviors that then isolate them further from society. Youth that are engaged in multi-systemic therapy show significant reductions in their problematic sexual behaviors. Using this multi-systemic therapy, different systems, the family system, as well as sometimes the school system sometimes gets involved, as well as kind of the community, it can be really, really helpful. So, yeah. Skills training programs include things like how to carry on a conversation, teaching them how to develop intimacy, using things like Thanos, right, can be really helpful. Doing basic sex education is also super important. So even though somebody may be engaging in some sort of sexual variation, they may not know anything about sex ed in particular, right? So that can be really important to try to teach them about sex ed, ways to develop intimacy with others, and how to carry on conversations with other people. If you all came to office hours today, at the very end, we watched a video on sex surrogacy. Sex surrogates are people who interact socially and sexually with clients that have sexual disorders of some sort. And the sex surrogate works with another therapist together to try to help that client. If you've never seen or never heard of sex surrogates, definitely YouTube a video on sex surrogacy. And so you can learn a little bit more about the use of sex surrogacy as therapeutics with therapists for people who need them. There's a great movie that was done by Helen Hunt about the story of a man who was a quadriplegic and how he was able to have his very first and only sexual interaction with a sex surrogate, and how meaningful that was for him as a quadriplegic. So definitely look that up. There's the discussion and activity on sex surrogacy. And I think that you'll. The use of a trained sex surrogates as part of a program designed to teach someone how to interact sexually is A, unlikely to benefit participants because of the process, B, widely used by sex therapists to model appropriate responses, C, uniformly considered to be prostitution and illegal, or D, a type of skills training controversial. Sex surrogates are D, it's a type of skills training that's highly controversial, and there's not a lot of sex surrogates in the country. And you can imagine it is very controversial because many people believe that, sex surrogacy is similar to paying someone for sex, like prostitution. And actually, engaging in sex surrogacy for a therapeutic change in someone's life, working with a therapist, is a little bit different than sex work. And there's many areas in the United States that have, coming upon trying to understand, and also trying to make sure that we're protecting people who are engaging in sex work. And so there's countries like Amsterdam, right, where people who engage in sex work are given governmental STI testing for free, right? They're given OBGYN services for free. And so when we look at Las Vegas and Nevada, particularly just Las Vegas, and the use of sex workers there, I think that we have a lot as a country to come to terms with as far as the way we hypersexualize everything in the media, and everything is about selling things through sex, right? Look at the advertising, my goodness, right? Look at the Super Bowl ads, right? Look at the cheerleaders on the sidelines of football games, right? Our whole culture is around selling things through sexuality, and yet we have people then who make a living based on selling sexual behaviors with other people, and they are oftentimes, if they are low income individuals who don't have as high education, they are seen as being prostitutes. But the same people doing the same behaviors for someone who is very wealthy, perhaps somebody who has a very good education, what is that called? It's not called prostitution, it's called something else. What do we call that? Like being a madam, right? Or being an escort, right? Those exact behaviors. And some people were calling a prostitute, and some people were calling a madam or an escort. So I think that our culture has a lot to do to come to grips with how it's so sexualized, and yet it really punishes people. It's very interesting, I think. So I hope that this has been an interesting, thought-provoking concept, the idea of sex surrogacy, and I hope you'll learn some more about it and think about how you feel about it, right? What are your thoughts about that? But as always, kind of decisional thing that I have in the spreadsheet, and think through it and think through all of the dimensions, do your research, and then you make a decision about it. All right. So then what are some other treatments of sexual variations? Well, one of the treatments for sexual variations are 12-step programs. They're modeled on the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. It is a more common treatment for sex addiction, for compulsive sexual behavior in more recent years. It combines it combines cognitive restructuring from cognitive behavioral therapy with enhancing spirituality, where the person admits that they're powerless over their sexual behavior, that there's a higher power that can help them. And so the 12-step programs for sex addiction, compulsive sexual behavior, people who identify themselves as sex addicts include SA. There's also a 12-step program for people who label themselves as sex and love addicts. There's also programs for the partners or loved ones of people who consider themselves to be sex addicts or sex and love addicts. One of those is called FUN, and another one of those is called COSA. And so these 12-step programs have been found to be very helpful for some people who want to go through them. I think one of the most important things that we've learned about helping people who are engaging in different sexual variations is what works is really defined by if the person wants to participate in that type of therapy or that type of treatment. Programs are really only as effective when participation is voluntary. And so I think that it's really important to understand that the treatment of sexual variation, that some programs are more effective than other programs are. The use of hormonal medications show the largest effect, particularly for people who are engaging in sexual behaviors that we know are harming other people, that the use of hormonal medications really has been shown to be effective, the androgen blockers. Program effectiveness really varies by the type of offenders. And also whether or not they want to change their behavior, right? So when participation is voluntary, the programs are more effective. I hope that you enjoyed this chapter, chapter 14, and the next chapter you'll get on a lecture will be chapter 17, and I'll be sending that one to you, out to you soon. Thanks.